Her name, Bertha Adams. Age 75. Weight 50 pounds. She was found deceased alone on an Easter Sunday. According to the coroner's report, the cause of her death was malnutrition. When state authorities made the primary investigation of her place, they found a veritable, and I quote, pig pen, the biggest mess you can imagine. One seasoned inspector declared he'd never seen a dwelling in greater disarray. The pitiable woman had begged food from her neighbors, and what clothes she had gotten from the Salvation Army. From all appearances, she was a penniless recluse, a pitiful and forgotten widow. But such was not the case. Amid the jumble of her unclean, disheveled belongings, 2 keys were found, which led officials to safe deposit boxes at 2 different banks. The discovery was absolutely unbelievable. The first box contained over 700 AT&T stock certificates, plus hundreds of other valuable certificates, bonds, and solid financial securities, not to mention a stack of cash amounting to nearly $200,000. The second box had no securities, only currency, $600,000 to be exact. Adding the net worth of both boxes and adjusting their value to today's value, that woman had over $5.5 million. Bertha Adams' hoarding was tragic, and her death was an unusually grim testimony to the shriveled focus of her life. You see, her wealth did her no good whatsoever. Its proper use could have meant good health for her and for many others. And R. Kent Hughes, who shares that illustration in his commentary, claims that James, in verses 2 and 3 of the 5th chapter of his book, makes it clear that such hoarding is obscene. And I agree with him. But I'd add that James does more than point out the folly of becoming entrapped by wealth's seductive but hollow promises. James invites us and encourages us to live every day knowing that Jesus will keep his promise to return, and God is going to bring about the end that he said he would bring about. I encourage you to open a Bible or a Bible app to James chapter 5. As we continue to dig into this New Testament book, which offers so much practical and relevant advice, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12 this morning. James chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Here's how it reads in the New International Version of the Bible. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and your silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance, and you've seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord's full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you'll be condemned. Now, it may seem that the verses we've just read contain this mishmash of unrelated topics, and James is just simply, jumping haphazardly from one thing to another. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think in these verses, James has one primary overarching thought, and he gathers together three different areas of our lives under it to illustrate how that one overarching thought, if taken to heart and believed, will in actuality affect every single area of our lives. An umbrella. And today's rain illustrates what James is doing in these verses. Now, I know they say it's bad luck to open an umbrella indoors, but I don't buy into those superstitious notions, many of which have, ties to idolatrous beliefs. So I've opened this umbrella. Now, if the rain, I don't hear it right now on the roof, so it's either stopped or it's let up for the moment. It's supposed to continue throughout the day. But let's say it was raining pretty hard right now, and I stepped outside, with this umbrella, and started walking around the parking lot holding this umbrella over me. It would have an effect, not only on how dry the top of my head remains, but it'd have an effect on how dry my shoulders and my arms and my chest remains. And in theory, and actually maybe in practice, depending upon the velocity of the wind, the umbrella would have an effect upon how dry every part of my body remains. Now, take this umbrella idea of how it affects how dry I will remain during these spring showers that we're having today, as long as I stand under it, and apply that same principle here, and I think you get the idea of what James is doing. You see, James is saying to us this: we've got Jesus' promise that he's going to return. Now, if we truly believe that Jesus is going to return, and we understand what Jesus is going to do when he returns, it's not going to affect just one small part of our lives. It's going to affect every part of our lives, because it's going to become for us an umbrella type of belief. It's going to become this promise that you and I will want to be covered by. And I say this is what James is up to in all these verses, because each of these different things he brings up, whenever he brings them up, he always ties it somehow to the return of Jesus. When he talks about the very selfish, he mentions in the very first verse, the misery that is coming on you. Well, that's a reference to the way Jesus is going to punish the selfish rich and bring about justice when he returns. And when James encourages those brothers and sisters who are apparently being victimized by the rich to be patient and to not grumble against them, he mentions the Lord's coming there in verse 7. He also claims in verse 9 that the judge is standing at the door. And then when he brings up the prophets, he brings up Job as an example of somebody who was patient when facing incredible tragedy and hardship. James reminds those who read his letter or hear the contents of this letter what the Lord finally brought about in Job's life. Adding to that the comment, the Lord's full of mercy and compassion. And again, you see, the call and encouragement to be patient is made because of what? Because of Jesus' promised return and the compassion and the mercy that he is going to show his people. And when James brings up those things about not swearing by heaven and earth, but simply making use of the words yes and no, which really have to do with our being honest and trustworthy, he adds to those thoughts that those who aren't trustworthy and honest, they're going to be condemned. And of course, the idea that's being conveyed there is they're going to be condemned for their dishonesty. What? By Jesus when he returns. You see, friends, for James, the promised return of Jesus and the end which God has promised to bring about, those things together become this overarching, this guiding principle. They became the guiding principle for the whole of his life. And James is saying to all of us that those things also should be the umbrella under which we live our lives. He's saying that all of our thoughts and all of our dreams and all of our actions, in other words, the whole of our lives should be influenced by our knowledge and belief that Jesus is going to return and God's going to end things the way he has told us he's going to end them. And to be sure, okay, James isn't just saying that our lives should be influenced somewhat or a little bit by our knowledge and belief that Christ is going to return and God's going to bring about the end the way he said he's going to bring it about. James is saying that our knowledge and belief in Jesus' sure return and that God's going to bring about what he said he's going to bring about, he's saying those things should carry the most influence of anything in our lives. Why? Because of the result we want to experience in the end, at the end of our lives. Now the question, of course, is it? Is our knowledge and our belief that Jesus is going to return and that God's going to bring about what he said he's going to bring about in the end, is that for us working as an overarching principle, is that the most influential thing that we have in our lives? Go back to the umbrella illustration. You know, when we choose to hold an umbrella over us, and we choose to stand under an umbrella during a downpour for a reason, right? And that reason is to what? Stay dry. Stay as dry as possible. If we're trying to stay as dry as possible, it wouldn't make sense for us, right? To have the umbrella up and then, take the umbrella and then turn around and say, okay, I want to stay as dry as possible. But we put our arm out. That's not going to work, right? Or we say, I want to stay as dry as possible. It's not going to work. And it's not going to work if we say, I want to stay as dry as possible. I want to stay as dry as possible. No, you have to stay as much as possible under the umbrella for that to work. And so again, if our desire is to experience an end that results in our ending up in the kingdom of heaven, then we are going to have this overarching principle and belief in the return of Jesus and the knowledge of what God's going to bring about, which he said he's going to bring about in our scriptures. That's going to become the most influential thing in our lives. It will influence our thoughts. It will affect all of our decisions. It will affect all of our actions. In other words, if we believe Jesus is going to return and God's going to bring about the end, which he describes in the Bible, we're going to live our lives with the end in mind. Now, I don't mind telling you that these things that James wrote here and the illustrations he gave us got me to wondering as to how well is the church doing on these things today. I mean, after all, James wrote this letter back in the first century. He wrote this letter a couple thousand years ago. And one of the biggest complaints you hear these days about the church and the Bible is that, they're not relevant. And so I started thinking, okay, here we are 2,000 years later. Are James' words still relevant? Do Christians today still struggle with the same things he wrote about? And I started wondering, I wondered, are there Christian business owners today who are making huge profits and hoarding those profits? Are there Christian business owners today who are underpaying their employees or giving them only the minimal amount of benefits when they could give them so much more, and who are at the very same time, while they're being so skimpy with their employees, living the life of luxury themselves? Well, I don't have proof of it. I can't, provide you an illustration of someone that I know this is what they're doing, but surely there are people like that today. But then I went a step further, and I just started thinking about the average churchgoer in America. And I began wondering, does the average churchgoer in America handle his or her finances in ways which show that they are living with the end in mind? And I got to tell you, I'm just not so sure. You see, I did some research, and some of the things I found kind of made me think that maybe the average American churchgoer's finances aren't being as influenced as they ought to be by their beliefs that Jesus is coming back and God's going to bring about the end He's told us He's going to bring about in the Bible. You see, my research showed me that today's Christians are giving 2.5% of their income to the church, which is, by the way, less than the 3.3% that Christians gave during the Great Depression. My research also showed that the average giving by adults to Protestant churches is about $17 per week, which translates to $884 per year. My research showed that 37% of churchgoers don't give anything to the church. And at the same time that I read, those things, I read that last Christmas, the average American, which includes the average Christian American, the average American last year spent $900 on Christmas-related purchases. The average American household last year spent nearly $3,700, more than 4 times the amount given to the church on average, on entertainment. You hear these things, and we read these things, and doesn't it just make us wonder what our bank statements reveal about the depth of our faith? And just how much influence our knowledge and belief that Jesus is going to return and God's going to bring about the end that He's talked about in the Bible, how much that influence that actually has on our money-making decisions. Then you've got the being patient and grumbling things that James brings up here. You do realize, don't you, that in this context in which James has written here, he's asking us not only to be patient with our life's circumstances when they're difficult, not only to be patient with people who make our lives difficult, but he's also asking us to be patient with God. In the sense, he's asking us to be patient with the timeline that God operates by. We're told in the Bible that patience is a fruit of the Spirit. It's something God produces in us. But when it comes to God producing the fruit of the Spirit, okay, here's what I understand the Bible to be teaching us. God doesn't force His way into our lives or into any area of our lives. Rather, He only works in those areas of our lives that we open up to Him. Think in terms of the word picture that Jesus gave us in the book of Revelation, where He says He stands at the door and He knocks and He waits for someone to let Him in. And so when we take that concept and we apply it to the fruit of the Spirit, I get this idea that God only produces the fruit of the Spirit as we give Him room to do it. And now here's where I'm going with this. When trouble comes to our lives, and it will, Jesus told His followers, He says, in this life you will have trouble. When trouble comes, and by trouble I'm talking about anything and everything that makes life difficult. I'm talking about those things that bring us pain, things that bring heartache, things that create financial burdens, things that sadden us or grieve us, things that worry us. I'm talking about tragedy and loss and inconveniences and all the other stuff that's hard to deal with and face. When trouble comes into our lives, we've got some options as to how we will allow those things to affect our relationship with God. We can choose, when trouble comes, to be patient with God and draw near Him and trust Him and His timing and trust that His plan is good and right. Or we can choose to be impatient with God and push away from Him and question His timing, question His plan, question His goodness, maybe even question His existence. James here is encouraging us to cling to God and to hold on to our faith in tough times by reminding us that just as God brought about an end to the tough times that Job faced, He's going to bring about an end to the tough times Jesus' followers face. Because He's full of compassion and mercy. Hanging in there when times get tough is something we will do, friends, if we are living with the end in mind as a follower of Jesus. So also is our being honest and trustworthy in the way we live, and especially in the things we say. You know, the things that James wrote there about swearing by heaven or earth really has nothing to do with the kind of vulgarity that comes to most of our minds when we hear that word swearing. I mean, usually when we hear the word swearing, we think of people spewing these nasty words from their mouths. The kinds of words that show up in comic strips, as symbols that are followed by exclamation points. Usually I think when we think of swearing, we oftentimes think of people taking God's name in vain in moments of anger or frustration. But that's not the kind of thing that James is talking about here. James is talking about the common practice of adding words to statements to assure the people we're talking to that we're telling them the truth. He's talking about employing phrases like, back in the first century, maybe they would have said something like, "You can count on my words to be as true as much as you can count on the sun rising in the morning," which would be what? Swearing by heaven. Or they might have said, I swear to you on our father Abraham's grave in Jerusalem's temple, I'm telling you the truth, which would be swearing by earth. Lots of us, as small children, probably use the expression, "cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye," as this added convincer that what we just said was true. And maybe we'd say that, and we'd actually say that while we would be lying. And then when we were confronted later about not telling that person the truth who we said that to, we say to them, what? Well, my fingers were crossed, so it didn't really count anyway, right? Maybe when we got a little older, we employed the phrase, I swear on a stack of Bibles, I'm telling you the truth. Or we use the phrase, as God is my witness, I'm not lying. James is saying here, look, if you and I live with the end in mind, if we live knowing and believing that Jesus is going to return and that when he returns, he's going to bring about judgment and he's going to bring about the end that God has said he would bring about, an end where, rebellious, unrepentant sinners and hypocrites and people who said with their lips that, they love God and believe God, but whose hearts were really far from him, where those people are going to be punished. And Jesus' faithful followers are going to be rewarded and welcomed into heaven. If we believe those things, James is saying, then our lives will reflect that knowledge and those beliefs by our being so honest and trustworthy in our daily lives that people will just know that they can take us by our word. And we won't have to try and convince them through the tacking on of some phrases that, this time we're actually telling the truth. Again, James, through all of his words here about, this folly of making the pursuit of wealth the thing that drives you, and the need to hold on tightly to our faith in tough times and our living honestly, honest, trustworthy lives, they're all meant to encourage us to live with the end in mind. To live knowing that Jesus is going to return and that God's going to bring about an end to things the way he said he would. And the reason James is encouraging us this way is pretty obvious, isn't it? He's encouraged us to live with the end in mind because he is fully convinced himself that things are going to happen just as God said they would. Paul, likewise, was convinced of those things. Again, it was his words that I read right before I sang that song one day, and you join me in singing the chorus when we all get to heaven. Paul was convinced that God's going to do what he said he's going to do, and that Jesus is going to return just as promised. The Apostle Peter was convinced of those things as well, friends. And it's with words that he wrote in the 3rd chapter of his 2nd letter that I'm going to bring things to a close. Listen to what Peter wrote in the 3rd chapter of his 2nd letter, beginning at the 3rd verse. Peter wrote this: "Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. And they will say, well, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it's been going since the beginning of creation. But Peter writes, they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord's not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he's patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. And Peter says, since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we're looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. And so then, dear friends, Peter concludes, since you are looking forward to this, make every effort to be found spotless, blameless, and at peace with him. You see what Peter's done in these words? He's made it very clear. He believes Jesus is going to return. He believes God's going to bring things to an end the way he said he would. He wrote, the day of the Lord will come. He was confident in its coming. He didn't know when that day would come, and that's why he wrote, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And since you and I don't know that day either, it's all the more reason for you and I to do exactly what Peter tells us to do, which is to make every effort to be found spotless, blameless, and at peace with him. Which again, when you think about it, friends, you realize it's just another way of saying what? We need to live with the end in mind. And my hope and my prayer is that each and every one of us will do just that.